Yes, I have.
Today is going to be awesome for many reasons, including that there's a handout. Because we have visitors, and I only made enough for enrolled students, I'm going to start circulating this pile. They're stapled. They're two-sided. I'm going to start this. You guys enrolled students sitting in the front row? Okay. If you're a visitor, please don't grab one of those quite yet until we know that we have enough. Thank you. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Today, I'm very excited. We have a guest teacher. And before we get into that, and apropos the handout that is going around, I thought that I would do just a brief contextualizing of the modeling technique that Tom Meloche is going to teach us today from actual client engagement that my company worked on to help sort of calibrate our thinking about this before we dig in. So part one is going to be very brief with this very brief case study, and then the rest of the time we are going to learn how to do this modeling approach, and Tom Meloche, who I will introduce in a minute, will teach us this. We certainly picked the wrong day for an architecture parade. Today would have been much better. Thank you all again for going through that. Toward the end of our discussion with Paul Daniels, the nature of the conversation got into something that I don't want to leave alone. Some of you may recall that as I was prodding Paul to talk about bathrooms and architecture and how owners have requirements for those, how there are codes is what Paul was focusing on, and then getting into the territory of who gets to decide what is code. And he was saying that those building codes that as a licensed architect, when he signs those plans, one of the things that he's doing is saying that this design is in compliance with that existing code. And Paul was saying that that existing code maps back to values. And I'm interested in this topic because it shows where values and culture and structure all collide in very important ways. And the nature of Paul's remarks toward the end last time belie, I think, a conservative point of view on these matters. And it is certainly not the only point of view. So I don't want to let go of that, but it doesn't fit into the discussion for today. So it's a long way of saying, next week, I will reopen that because I think there is something to be learned that I don't want to miss out on. So that's a little prelude, pre-figuring what we'll do next week. But this week, what we're going to do is talk about object-relational models in an information architecture context. And if my computer would behave, there is something very obvious here. And you may have noticed already that I'm a big fan of dumb in all of its resplendent dumbness. Simple things that we may just gloss over if we didn't pause and think about them. And this is on the screen on your right. This little diagram that I drew is based on a really dumb idea that was articulated awfully well by Chris Alexander, the second of the architects that we're focusing on here that we'll get to a little bit later. But what he talks about is good fit, that something architects could be held accountable for is good fit. And what he's talking about is a fit between the form of the thing that's being worked on and, in his way of saying, the things that we can control, and that's a pretty big we in some cases, that's form. And then there are these forces in the environment, and with a building, there's the force of gravity, but there are so many other forces, but it's pretty simple to think about those forces in terms of elemental forces like gravity. The building will not stand up unless you take into account the force of gravity. There are many other forces in the environment that would be responsible for, Chris Alexander would say, a good fit between those forces and the form? Yes, back row. Do we run out of handouts? Okay, I must not have made enough. Well, we will, why don't we have every other one of you pass one down to the right, and we'll do sharesies. I know that's a little bit of a fire drill, but everybody who has one, if you pass every other, how's that gonna work?
We're good now.
Okay, good, we don't have to do that. So one of the forces in this environment is instability in the number of students who show up. The roster says we have 57. On some days we've had fewer than 40. So the form, the thing that I can control, I made a bad choice about form and something just fell down. I mean, it's that simple, but that's a pretty powerful way to look at the kinds of work that we all get to do, connecting people with information through technology. So we have control over the form, oftentimes, but not the forces. And in order to achieve a good fit, the argument goes, we need to understand the forces in the environment. The way that my company does work, this is a picture of the delivery model that we use at the Understanding Group. The way that we see this is that in the first part of a project, in the doing more of the architecting work, that is more of the work of figuring out the what. And a lot of that in the program and analysis phases is trying to document, trying to tell the truth to ourselves and the client team about what's going on. What are the forces in the environment? Can we tell the truth? If gravity was one of those forces and we said, here's an equation to calculate gravity, and that equation is wrong, everything that happens from there is going to fall apart. And so architects and designers working together in the upfront part to really solidify the truth about what is the environment, what are the forces, and then moving into design, then coming up with a form that can accommodate them. And the little case study I'm going to tell you about before we let Tom get into this is from a project that we did in the first two parts of that delivery model. It was for a customer who had more than 100 locations that they were doing business out of across the country. We were working for the head office, and what the head office had decided is that the Windows-based application that they were using in all of the treatment rooms, this is a health, would you call it healthcare?
Yeah.
Cosmetic healthcare munge of a business concept, that in these 100 or more locations, they were using Windows-based, it's like Windows NT maybe, really old version of Windows-based software.
Something totally unsupported.
Not supported by Microsoft anymore, and their poor internal tech team was just patching and duct taping and wiring this thing to keep it together. And they reached a point, and often this point is caused by money. And the point that they reached was being acquired by a venture capital group who saw this software as an obstacle from going from 100 locations to 1,000 locations. The venture capital folks wanted to scale up this business. They thought the business concept was sound. There were a lot of forces in this environment that they liked, but it was decided that the software system that everything depends on was holding them back. And so I love this quote from the textbook from Molly, pointing out that the word that we use for models gets at this idea of measuring. And at this point in a architectural project that you're not yet measuring the built artifact itself, what you're measuring with these models is an idea, the fitness of the concept for what it's supposed to do. And so what these folks wanted my company to do in 3 weeks was to understand everything about the existing software posit a web-based, so this was a EXE, a Windows executable that ran on Windows machines in all these locations. They wanted to reimagine this software as something that is delivered over the web through a web browser, and to do that in about 3 weeks from a documenting all the things that the existing thing does standpoint, and then positing a solution that knows enough about all of the stuff that the current version did for them to make a build or buy decision about moving forward. And in the course of this 3 weeks, our team, and Dan O'Neill's here from the Understanding Group, Tom Meloche as a consultant to us was a part of that project. We were able to do it and do it good. We all thought the client was thrilled with the work that we did. And my sense is that we would not have been able to do this, maybe at all, let alone in 3 weeks, without this really dumb modeling approach that everybody could agree to. So, and these are, what I passed around are a lightly redacted version of the object-relational models that Tom Meloche built for this project. And what these models are doing is trying to tell the truth. And in the last couple of class sessions, I talked to you about my sense of information architecture being about situating information in space, and that the relationships between the things we're situating becomes part of that architecture. This here way of capturing what are the forces in the environment, who are all the actors in this environment, what are all the things? This was essential to us being able to do our work. And of course, this doesn't fully deliver on that, right? You couldn't diagram all of the things. You can't capture all of the relationships. You can try, but that's a fool's errand. The software keeps changing, the world keeps changing. So this level of abstraction, it's not so abstract that it's up in the clouds and you can't do anything with it. And it's also not so granular that it becomes the territory itself. There's that famous saying, the map is not the territory. There's some level of abstraction here. And this way of modeling, in my experience, delivering information architecture consulting work, strikes that really great balance between how much granularity is wise to be working at, how many details do we want to get, and can we tell the truth? Could you build software against this picture of the world? And in most of the instances where my company has used this tool, and again, it's a means of analysis. There's a way of using this tool to indicate what is the more preferred set of relationships between objects and actors in the environment. But what this critically did for us, and I think learning to walk before we learn how to run, the way that I think it'll be most helpful to us, and the way I want to see you use it in a group assignment in a couple of weeks, is to analyze context, to understand what are the relationships, what are the things, what are the actors in this environment. And I'm curious if anybody already knows this. Is this something that, my sense is after I saw this, wow, we should teach this in high school. We should teach this to anybody who wants to bring rigor to a complex space and then propose changes. So I'm curious, has anybody been shown how to do this yet? Okay, yeah, me neither. So I'm very excited to be shown how to do this. And with that, I will start introducing Tom Meloche, who is somebody that the Understanding Group has known for. My partner, Bob Royce, has known Tom for 30 or more years, yeah. Maybe?
Longer than we care to admit now.
And I'm curious how many of you might know the software, would you call them a software consultancy here in town?
Yeah.
Menlo Innovations. Show of hands, has anybody heard of Menlo? That is a company that Tom founded and sold many years ago. And I consider Tom to be a pioneer in the field of object-oriented analysis, object-oriented programming, all that kind of good stuff. And so if I can figure out how to get Tom's computer to be the one that broadcasts, and we will turn this one on, and we'll turn these ones off.
Yeah. Yeah, it's apparently being recorded.
Yes. That's why we should
So I was in a meeting with a company, I don't think I'm allowed to say the name of, with Dan out on the West Coast. And Bob Royce was there. We're doing some more consulting with the Understanding Group. They bring me in when they have fun clients. And I wasn't paying too much attention, but at a certain point, Bob goes, Tom will explain now all that he's going to do with object diagramming for this project. And I look up and I'm like, oh, I'm on stage. Yeah, I'm going to describe the things and how they relate to the other things. And then I stopped. The answer, like everyone else, but Dan's like, brilliant. I'm like, good, I'll write that down. That'll become the name of the talk. Things and how they relate to other things. So that's the name of this talk. I won't introduce myself a lot. I Google well. So if you want to know more about me, just type into Google Tom Meloche and it'll come up. Except it says I'm like an acoustical sound engineer. I don't know where that came from. But everything else on the page is me. I was one of the 4 founders of Menlo Innovations. I sold it years ago now, almost a decade ago, because I wanted to explore agile software development and this technology out in bigger organizations. So one of the most recent larger engagements I did was at USAA in San Antonio. They're a giant insurance company / bank. We were spending $1.5 billion a year on software development. We had 4,000 developers. I was managing a team of 20 coaches to make sure that what we were delivering was good and on time and on budget and agile. None of that is a sane way to develop software. And we're going to hit a little of that history when we talk today about object technology. Most of what today is meant to be, by the way, is going to be a workshop. So I'm going to be talking and introducing some of these concepts, but I'm only going to be talking for the first few minutes before we start getting you hands-on applying this, because the only way to really get your head around this stuff is to apply it. I have some guests of my own in the front row. I've thrown in a couple slides just for them at a few important times, where I'm going to make the connection between this style of analysis and software architecture. So just so you know, occasionally I'll start talking like a dolphin. That's what my brother says when I say anything technical. This gentleman was around this age. How many people recognize him? I think you do. Steve Jobs. In 1979, he made a visit to the PARC Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, who'd built upon some great work that was also being done, had been started at Stanford University. And the knowledge was out there. It's not like it was all a secret in PARC, but PARC was the place where people were putting this all together. In a sense, everything that you think about as likely being a computer and computation was developed at PARC, with the exception of the World Wide Web. And he went there and he said he saw 4 amazing things when he was there. He saw the graphical user interface and the mouse. He saw laser printing. He saw networking. And he saw object technology. He's like, I got so excited by the graphical user interface and the mouse that I actually really missed networking and object technology. And that's a challenge even to this day, is that we're missing networking. Well, we finally got that. We're still missing object technology. The reason I find it interesting is because it's trying to unify a conceptual view of what it means to build systems together. So when I build those little diagrams that Dan was showing that have been passed around, and I'm looking at an as-is view of the world, I begin to conceptually model it by the things that are literally there. As I begin to think about the to-be model, I use most of those same things. They're still going to be there. If I'm in a hospital, if I'm in a clinic, and they were there, a lot of them still will be there. So that vocabulary that comes up, that nature of the knowledge of the things, who uses the things, and how they interact with the things is still applicable. What object technology was meant to do in terms of software architecture was take that same conceptual view and move it directly into application programming interfaces. How we think about a system as we begin to design the structure of the computer system that we're going to build. And then what object technology does is connect that all the way down to the lines of code that we write. And so that as we build systems, it's meant to be dramatically more organic. If you actually could understand what he saw when he visited Park Xerox. By the way, there was a very specific computer language that had been developed and was being used there called Smalltalk, which was designed to make this seamless and easy. I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out why we don't do more of this. It's actually absurd and a wee bit obscene to me for a company to be spending $1.5 billion a year and have 4,000 people developing software. Why? Because I know if you do it this way, it probably takes 400. It's dramatically more efficient way to think about the universe, because most of what you're doing isn't building a system for the first time. Most of it is cycling. I have features and I design, I implement, and I have budget, and I bring it together. If I'm using the same conceptual vocabulary, the same way of understanding, the same object model throughout this whole process, it becomes dramatically easier to maintain and add features to the software over time. I had built this once at a company called AccuSun. I'd gotten to build the software from the ground up and live with it for 3 or 4 years as an object developer. And when I left the company, interestingly enough, to join one Bob Royce was running, a developer went to pick up my work. And I'm like, here's how you think about it, here's what it is, here's the models. And they got an assignment. Hey, we have a bunch of printers we're supporting, add another printer. And they're like, how long will it take? And they're like, well, normally this would take about 30 days. And I'm like, great. And then I asked them, when I bumped into them later, I'm like, how long did it take you? 2. And I'm like, I hope you didn't tell them it only took you 2. I made it so that it'd go in that fast, but never tell the, that's the win. That's what Steve Jobs missed. And near as I can tell, the whole industry has missed to this day. That's the power meant by this type of analysis technique. The power we should be having that we're not getting. So the book that before I created Menlo, I was working in another company, and we piloted the idea of what Menlo calls high-tech anthropology or solution anthropology. A lot of it is the work that Tug does. We piloted the idea of a team that does that. And this was the book that my high-tech anthropologists, my information architects, liked to use at the time. And it was called UML Distilled, Applying the Standard Object Modeling Language, first edition. Now, the first edition was actually written by Kendall Scott and Martin Fowler. I put Kendall Scott in big letters because I worked with him. I learned something really important working with Kendall Scott. When you write the first edition of a book and you're doing most of the work with another named person, put in your contract that they can't take your name off the book. That was actually the big lesson I learned. When I later published a book, I put that into my contract, and I'm now on the 3rd edition of The Ultimate Guide to Facebook Advertising, a book I wrote. This book got worse with each edition, like dramatically worse, because with each edition, it got bigger. Like the 2nd edition, when Martin saw how well the 1st edition did, he's like, oh, I'm going to get he added like 100 pages. It's like, when I'm going to teach you is, I don't know, about a dozen specific little notational techniques. That's it. And yes, you can learn and do more, and these guys tried to add, none of it helps. It gets in the way of understanding. So what we're literally going to teach you is everything you need to know in terms of notation to build those diagrams, and hopefully some of the thinking that went around it so that you can build those diagrams on your project. And if you want to reference, somebody even created another little, like the Elements of UML Style, a really tiny little book that I liked. And near as I can tell, for the most part, hardly anybody uses this anymore. So they've given up the benefits of object models, my only building slide, and then we're going to get to fun notation. What is this about when I start to do this? It's about focusing and structuring my thoughts. So if someone says you got 3 weeks to totally understand this business and begin to propose something to us, and we're the multi-billion-dollar executive, great. I'm going to sit down for an interview and talk to all of these executives. We talk to all of the senior executives in the company, and we talk to the people who made the billion-dollar investment. When you have those conversations, what do you do with the words you hear back? Do you just write them out as long notes? That's what most people do, right? They don't have a plan to focus and structure how they're thinking about it. If you walk into a clinic and you start to see all the things in a clinic, how do you focus and structure your thoughts? This is a way to focus and structure your thoughts. I like notations because it encourages meditation. Some of you will discover, if you start to do notations like this, that you'll spend way too much time moving things around and making lines line up. For the most part, do it anyway. If your brain is telling you, if your emotions are telling you, I want to move these lines around, maybe you should spend more time staring at your diagram. Diagrams are fundamentally for the creator of the diagram. It's a way for you to focus and structure how you think about it. They also invite collaboration. So you have a little handout of the things that we created. And I have a picture later in this, although I didn't get the picture I wanted. But when we went to talk to all of the senior executives at that company and the investors, we had them printed out as giant posters. And we gave them markers. And I first went up and I'm like, let's talk about what's going on in this one. Here's what I heard from you and your business. Is this right? And they're like, well, that's partially wrong. Great, I draw an X through it. Then they're like, oh, these diagrams are meant to be interactive. And then you give them pens and you're like, yeah, feel free, right? Let's use it to invite collaboration on what we're discussing. It also stimulates memory. We haven't done this gig for a couple of years now, but we could probably both go to that diagram and literally describe that business to you for the next 2 to 3 hours if we wanted to. Just walking through the diagram and seeing how it stimulates our memory. When I walk into most businesses that develop software, maybe 1 out of 50 has a set of good diagrams on the wall to facilitate conversations about the architecture and their view of the system that they're building. 1 out of 50. So I have another thing that I like to ask. It's a phrase. Out of sight is out of mind. Out of sight is out of mind. So if I take all that architecture and I bury it in a computer somewhere where I don't even create it to begin with, where is it? Out of, yeah. So if I don't see it on the wall, I'm pretty sure we're not really talking about it. We're not using it to foster communication. And we were at a place, I was at another giant insurance company, and we put up a big, long, one of the diagrams we're going to look at today, activity diagrams. Had a big, long activity diagram, and people are like, no one wants to talk about it, no one will talk about it. We're like, well, put it up on the wall, and some markers. And we'll do a couple markups so that they can put a note, please rank this up. Suddenly people began to stop. Suddenly people began to mark. Suddenly we began to trigger conversations. Agile calls this radiating. So if you've been to Menlo or another place, you'll often see things on the wall. Somebody coined the term radiating information. It's on the wall and it's radiating at you. If I put an architecture on the wall, for the most part, it's going to disappear. After a while, you're going to stop seeing it. However, you're going to glance at about 50,000 times over the course of 6 months. If out of those 50,000 times you glance at it, you actually think about it twice, you've just thought about it 2 more times than you would if you left it buried in a computer. That's why I like radiating diagrams. And good models predict the future. Why did it take only 2 days for her to add the next printer when I left the company? Because the very nature of the modeling exercise was meant to predict the future. It was meant to understand the things that were there, how they're used, and to use those to predict how they're likely to be used in the future. And so when a new need came along, it wasn't I have to rebuild everything from the ground up. It's like, oh, we've mostly predicted this. In 2 days, I can add this new feature and we can release it. And lastly, this common language, and that's what we already talked about. Not just a common language for all of you if you're on the analysis team or your designers or your UX people or whatever role you go into if you continue to follow AI. It's a common vocabulary from analysis to design, to coding, to implementation, to testing, and back again. The same vocabulary comes back. So that's my sales pitch. Now let's actually talk about doing some of this. So we're going to pass out some paper. The first thing that I like to ask people to do is to simply go into a space, or when you're in an interview, to write down things. So we're only going to do this for like a minute, but it's sort of like to prime your head as you get the pieces of paper. On the piece of paper, we're going to ask you to write down things you see in the room. Feel free to stand up, turn around, look up, look down. What are the things that you see in the room? Begin to write down the things. Spend like the next minute and a half.
Paper should be being passed around. Or on the side. No.
Okay, don't think about this too hard. Just like write things.
I'm still wondering if the Zoom meeting has a, there we go. That's your desktop, okay. There we go.